On the eve of the first presidential debate, the Supreme Court gave a huge boost to Joe Biden to help him rig the 2024 election in one of the worst decisions of the year. It remains to be seen if the court's refusal to stop federal censorship will taint the credibility of American democracy. Last year, multiple federal courts documented how the FBI, Biden White House, Surgeon General, and other federal agencies had sabotaged Americans' freedom of speech. If you tried to complain about the COVID lockdowns, the school shutdowns, or even mail-in ballot fraud, your online comments could have been sabotaged, suppressed thanks to the threats and string pulling by the federal government or federal contractors. Conservatives were far more likely to be silenced by this censorship than were liberals or leftists. Federal judges respond to these outrages by issuing injunctions to stop the federal agencies from browbeating social media companies to wrongfully silence Americans. But on Wednesday, the Supreme Court decided to overlook all these abuses. There will be no injunction to stop the White House or federal agencies or federal contractors from suppressing criticism of Joe Biden and his policies before the 2024 election. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court gave the benefit of the doubt to federal browbeating, arm twisting, and jawboning, regardless of how many Americans are wrongfully muzzled. The Biden censorship industrial complex triumphed because most of the Supreme Court justices could not be bothered to honestly examine the massive evidence of these abuses. The majority opinion, written by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, whined that the record spans over 26,000 pages, and quoting an earlier decision, Barrett scoffed that judges are not like pigs hunting for truffles buried in the record. So I'm waiting to see if this line catches on with school kids. Starting next year, if the school kids are asked whether they did their homework, the kids can quote Justice Barrett and tell their teachers they are not like pigs hunting for truffles buried in the record of all their class assignments. Rather than swine groveling in the muck, the Supreme Court instead disposed of this landmark case on a quibble, putting their legal pinkies up in the air like a white wine drinker at a cocktail reception. The court ruled that the plaintiffs, including 2 state governments and eminent scientists banned from social media, did not have standing because they had not proven that their federal intervention and string pulling injured them. Bizarrely, the court denied standing even after it conceded that it may be true that social media platforms continue suppressing the plaintiff's speech according to policies initially adopted under government pressure. So why is that not a problem? Did the court decide to hold the government innocent unless there were signed confessions from White House officials and FBI bosses? When the court heard oral arguments on this case in March, most of the justices seemed clueless on this case, maybe even more clueless than I sounded in high school Spanish class. Maybe the outcome of this case was a foregone conclusion when Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson blathered that my biggest concern is the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in the most important time periods. To sanctify censorship, Jackson repeatedly invoked the specter of legions of American teenagers jumping out of windows thanks to a social media challenge. So to save the children, Justice Jackson tossed the First Amendment out the window instead. Unfortunately, 5 other justices joined the toss-out. The whole point of the Bill of Rights is to hamstring the government, to hamstring would-be federal tyrants. Justice Jackson's bizarre comment, this is what we pay judges for goodness sake. This is a case that was framed by Team Biden as whether the government would have the freedom to intervene against misinformation. Much of the press coverage presumed that government agencies are infallible oracles of Delphi. But the issue was censorship, not the latest self-serving definitions of misinformation that come out of the Beltway. Too often, misinformation is simply anything that makes people mistrust the government. And as far as the record in this case, don't forget the biggest misinformation during the COVID pandemic was President Biden's promise during a CNN town hall in July 2021, you're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations. That was true, plus or minus 200 million COVID cases. Subsequent waves of Delta, Omicron, and other COVID variants destroyed the credibility of Biden and federal health policymakers. Thanks to much of the censorship in recent years being inflicted by federal contractors, the Supreme Court held that Uncle Sam was effectively blameless. But as Justice Samuel Alito dissented, government officials may not coerce private entities to suppress speech. And he said that the Supreme Court decision signals if a coercive campaign is carried out with enough sophistication, it could stand as an attractive model for future officials who want to control what the people say, think, and hear. The federal district and the federal appeals court recognize that federal censorship is a clear and present danger to American democracy. What if the FBI browbeats social media companies to suppress new revelations of kickbacks that Biden received the same way the FBI helped suppress the 2020 New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop? What if federal agencies again launch a concerted campaign to silence any criticism of mail-in ballots, despite the deluges of fraud that previously occurred in U.S. history when those ballots were used? It's a sad day when Supreme Court justices behave like shiftless members of Congress who vote for a 1,000-page bill that they never bothered to read. In lieu of constitutional rights and government under the law, the Supreme Court tells Americans that they only deserve plausible deniability for government crimes. If we later learn that federal censorship changed the outcome of the 2024 election, will the Supreme Court simply shrug and tell citizens, never mind?